Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, February the 13th, 2024. Some issues never seem to go away, particularly those surrounding the implications, economic and otherwise, of slavery. A few years ago, we did a show on the deep ties between slavery and Wall Street with a writer, Jonathan Daniel Wells. He had a new book out at the time, The Kidnapping Club, Wall Street, Slavery and Resistance on the Eve of Civil War. We touched on the issue of reparations then, and we've discussed it in lots of shows since, but we're going to address it squarely today with my guest, who has a new book out this week. He isn't beating around the bush. He has a new book. It's called The Stolen Wealth of Slavery, A Case for Reparations. The author is David Montero, and he is talking to us from Boston. I'm interested, David, the subtitle of the book is A Case for Slavery rather than The Case. Does that suggest that there are many cases?
Well, it suggests that Black people especially have been making the case for reparations for a very long time. And what my book strives to do is amplify those voices, add to the argument by looking at the issue from a particular angle. So it is a case because it is part of a stream of cases, and I think that's a good thing, that there are many different voices talking about this issue.
As I suggested, we did the show. I'm sure you're familiar with Jonathan Daniel Wells and his book about the ties between slavery and Wall Street during and before the Civil War. Your argument is also a financial argument. It's about what you call the stolen wealth of slavery and these intimate associations between 19th, 18th, and 19th century American bankers and the slave industry. Is that fair?
Yeah, what the book really tries to do is put a new lens onto the issue of enslavement by following the money. And what I mean by that is I looked at and wanted to understand who really profited from slavery. What did they do with that money and how did they make it? And that journey led me to understand that although slavery took place in the South, the wealth that it generated and that enslaved people created did not principally benefit the South. The money did not stay in the South. The money moved. And it really fertilized the industries and the banks and the merchant houses of the North, because they controlled, and through financing and other means, the actual system of slavery. So, I wanted to look at deeply, by following the money, who was making this money, and who was putting money into slavery, who was taking money out of slavery. And the answer increasingly pointed me towards the North and towards Wall Street.
Your career so far as a journalist has focused on money. Your last book was Kickback, exposing the global corporate bribery network. So you're all too familiar with dirty money. We've done lots of shows on dirty money. Are you suggesting, though, David, that there was a conscious effort on the part, particularly of Wall Street and northern bankers, to profit from slavery? Did the bankers know what they were doing?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we have to remember that at the time, in the early 1800s, one of the most lucrative businesses in America was the production and export of cotton. It was a multi-million dollar, what would be now a multi-billion dollar industry. Banks on Wall Street knew this. I mean, the country as a whole knew this. They wanted a slice of the pie. They took increasingly a bigger slice of the pie in numerous ways, but one of them was by lending money to plantations. Plantations needed money to buy enslaved people, to buy more land, and to ship their goods, because the goods didn't stay in the South. They went to markets around the world. Yes, these bankers very consciously made a stake to claim in this business. Let me just also say that the way they became bankers in the first place and created some banks that we know today was by first being involved in this industry. What I trace in the book is that people who started out as merchants on Wall Street, meaning that they owned maybe one ship or three commercial ships, began sailing to the South and buying cotton or lending money to enslavers for their plantations and then shipping the cotton. With that money, they became more and more wealthy. And what they started doing in the early part of the 1800s, by around 1812, 1815, was forming banks. So that is the origin, for example, of Citibank. So it was, yes, it was a very conscious effort on the part of Wall Street bankers to capture this business, to profit from enslaved people's labor.
Yeah, you write about the famous Citibank of New York, President Moses Taylor, who, at least according to you, I'm quoting, conducted immense sums of money from slavery. The logic here, though, David, as you know, I mean, you've already been making this argument. You will continue as the book creates one kind of controversy or another. At what point does the logic of this argument hit a wall? I mean, couldn't you make the same argument about colonialism, for example, that there's the stolen wealth of colonial wealth, and that all of Africa and much of Asia and Latin America should get reparations from European powers, and for that matter, American settlers should be paying reparations to the indigenous peoples who originally inhabited this continent?
Sure, and that is a valid argument, and people are making that argument, and I think they are justified in making it. One of the things that I'm trying to argue in the book is that we should be looking at this issue specifically from the standpoint of banks and Wall Street, because those are not only the entities and the institutions that profited from this wealth, this stolen wealth. That money still exists, that wealth still exists. We know this because, in a sense, the banks tell us that themselves. They like to celebrate their long history, their long lineage. They do not say, for example, Citibank, today we are a different bank than the bank that was formed in 1812. If you go to their website, they proudly say that we're the same bank. We have a track record of financial excellence that stretches back to that time. They happen not to mention that time was a time of slavery, and that's how they made the seed capital and the foundational wealth that they now enjoy today. So what I'm trying to say is,
that's a convenient argument for you. I mean, these banks, those arguments are made by their marketing departments to give them some sort of historical credibility. They're not justifying it in terms of their association with slavery.
No, they avoid talking about their association with slavery, but what they proudly do is talk about their lineage. Part of their value as a brand is how old they are, how they've been able to survive for 200 years or 150 years as a corporation. Part of the way they've survived for 150 years as a corporation is by protecting the wealth that they initially made through enslavement or through shipping the goods that enslaved people made. So if they are allowed to say, today, our corporation exists because of our long history in protecting wealth for our clients and for ourselves, and by having a track record of success, then I think we get to say, well, that also means that the money you received from slavery, from enslaved people's unpaid labor, also exists in some form. That's the purpose of a corporation in the end, is to survive and to evolve, and that's what they've done with that seed capital.
So would your argument be, given its logic, that banks created since the Civil War, banks created in the late 19th, early 20th century, that they shouldn't be liable for reparations? It's only the older banks? Or is it the whole system, the whole Wall Street system, or American capitalism?
Well, I'm saying both. I'm saying it's specific banks. I think we can trace that specific banks, starting from 1790 up until the present day. So from 1790 to 1865, they made money from enslaved people's labor. All throughout that time, these banks, through their directors, were investing this money into other things. You mentioned that my background is in looking at dirty money. My first book was about money laundering, and that's what I'm saying in this new book. The people who made this money while at these banks were laundering it essentially. What does that mean? They were taking money from ill-gotten money, I would say, from slavery, and they were transforming it into other forms of wealth. So that meant they were investing it into the stock market, into industry, into railroads, into things that went on to survive, some of which survive to this
Right, I
day.
know. I take your point. But you're avoiding my question. I mean, should you say perhaps Citibank of New York should be liable, but what about Goldman Sachs or Lehman? I mean, these were banks formed after slavery.
Yes, I mean, I think this is an issue that will require nuance to work out. Many banks today are the result of acquiring and swallowing up other banks along the way. So yes, I think writ large, major Wall Street banks have a role to play, should pay reparations, because some of them certainly we can trace a direct lineage back to slavery. Others of them have profited from that system. It's a system of an ethos of doing business, but they also profited because they swallowed up other banks that had been involved in slavery. I think that I think if corporations are going to make the claim that they are corporate citizens, that they care about the communities from which they derive their wealth, even a bank that may not have, we can't easily trace its ties back to slavery, they have a role to play in reparations, in the discussion, and possibly in making payments.
Where does the argument, though, end, David? What about people who wore cotton, manufacturers of cotton, clothing manufacturers? At what point do you say, well, actually, these people aren't responsible and they shouldn't contribute to reparations?
Well, I think one of the ways that I look at this is, again, can we trace that the wealth survives? So that's why I'm specifically talking about banks and certain corporations. But you're talking about manufacturing companies, textiles. If some of those corporations existed in the 19th century and still exist today, then yes, I think that their business would not exist. Their wealth and their evolution to today would not have happened were it not for the unpaid labor of enslaved people. So yes, they have, I think, a moral obligation to pay reparations. No, we cannot trace every person who bought a cotton shirt. I think that the argument around reparations is people like to bog it down in these logistical challenges that make it seem so impossible to achieve this. There is a way, I think, to look at this through nuance and say, even if we can't trace every single person responsible, there are industries that have a role to play. There's a way to make meaningful repair.
Is there an international dimension here? If some of these American banks should pay reparations, what about British banks? What about financiers overseas?
Well, absolutely. And the interesting thing, I'm glad you raised the question, is the interesting thing is in the UK, banks, unlike in the United States, are starting to talk about and recognize their foundational role in enslavement. The Bank of England, for example, Lloyd's of London, a huge financial institution, they have finally started to look at their history and say that the British financial construct came to be because of enslavement. Our profits came to be because of enslavement. They have started talking about this. They have started outlining systems of repair. And we've just seen recently in Brazil that prosecutors are now charging the Bank of Brazil, the second largest financial institution in Latin America, with receiving its foundation from enslavement and therefore needing to pay reparations. There absolutely is a global dimension to this issue. And in fact, the US is very far behind. The corporate voice in this issue in the US is very far behind other places in the world.
What about the Southern dimension? I know you argue that the South has successfully, in some ways, created an argument about its impoverishment after the Civil War. Is it more than just reparations of Northern banks and the economic system? What about the responsibility of the entire South, which, of course, was the place where slavery was practiced?
Yeah, I'm not saying that it is only the obligation of Wall Street or Boston banks. I'm arguing that because they're often left out of the conversation. So much of the focus around enslavement, its history, and the issue of reparations, uh, I think falls in the South. Yes, Southern banks did profit as well from enslavement. They were at the front line and the frontier of expanding plantations. They do have a role to play. I'm just arguing that if you follow the money, I think northern banks, specifically on Wall Street, but also in Boston and Philadelphia, made a larger slice of the profits than Southern banks did. But yes, there are Southern industries, there are Southern families, there are Southern corporations, there are Southern banks. The issue of reparations is an issue that is going to require a broad swath of society, including the federal government, state and city officials, corporations, institutions, families, committing to repairing this damage, specifically through cash payments or other forms of investment. It's North and it's South.
I do want to get to the details after the break, because I think most people will be thinking, well, maybe there's some argument in theory, but what about the practice? When it comes to the stolen wealth of slavery, what about the stolen wealth of the failure of Reconstruction, for example, in the late 19th century, and of Jim Crow? At what point does everything become liable, at least in your method of argument, for a case for reparations?
Well, it's a connected history, right? Yes, the flow from the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson becomes president. Andrew Johnson reneges on so many things he said he was going to do to hold Confederates and the South responsible, reneged on 40 acres and a mule. And then as a result, there's a sweep of history that leads to segregation, Jim Crow. Yes, what Black people have been arguing, understandably, for a long time is that reparations deal with partially the history of enslavement, but there's a connection in the discriminatory policies, practices, and structures that were put in place in that time that led to Jim Crow, that led to discrimination, that led to banks, even as recently as the early 2000s and 2008 during the banking crisis, discriminating against Black people. It's a continuing dynamic of history. It's a continuum.
It's certainly a continuum, and what continues most of all, it's controversy. David Montero, the author of The Stolen Wealth of Slavery, A Case for Reparations. It's a theme, race, reparations, which is continually argued in American culture. Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, does a good job on this front. I want to remind everyone that high-quality guests like David Montero are brought to us because of Liberties. We're going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with David to talk more about the practice of 20th and 21st century reparations. So don't go away, anyone.
The news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought, a quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesquarterly.com. We are speaking with David Montero, the author of The Stolen Wealth of Slavery, a book which makes a case, not the case, but a case for reparations. David, don't need me telling you that this issue is very much alive, particularly where I am in California. California has already introduced the first in-nation slavery reparations package. Berkeley, California, over the bay where I used to live, is exploring making reparations to Black residents. How is this, in your view, or how should it work? It's becoming more concrete. It's not just an abstract argument.
What leading Black scholars, observers, thinkers have been saying about this is the following. William Darity, a scholar at Duke, has calculated that it is only the federal government that has the capacity to pay the amount of money truly in reparations that can meaningfully close the wealth gap that exists between white households and black households. He's calculated that figure at $14 trillion. Now, we can talk about that in a minute, that figure and how it would be paid, but his point is that the federal government has the responsibility and the means to pay this, primarily. In his remarks, he's also mentioned this is not a recipe for paralysis for other sectors of society. So he has argued it doesn't mean that corporations have no role. It doesn't mean that universities have no role. It doesn't mean that other sectors of society have no role. Reparations is going to require a primary impetus from the federal government to make cash payments to Black Americans, to outline other forms of reparative justice. But it's also going to require corporations to commit to this. Another pioneer in the reparations movement, who I feature in my book, Deidre Farmer Palmain, told me, I would like to see corporations, major corporations, pay $20 million a year into a trust fund that is administered by Black communities. She also added $20 million a year is what major corporations pay their CEOs. It's a drop in the bucket. So corporations, that is one idea.
A corporation might push back and say, I don't know, let's take a Silicon Valley corporation, which only got formed 20 years ago, Google or Facebook and Amazon. They might say, well, I'm troubled, of course, by the history of slavery, but I'm also troubled by the issue of global warming. I'm troubled by the issue of inequality, and many other issues, guns. Why should they choose this particular one when they weren't around when slavery existed?
And you mentioned the operative word there, choice. We have seen in the United States, the woman I just mentioned, Deidre Farmer Palmain, in the early 2000s, tried to sue in the federal courts a number of corporations, including large banks, for reparations. The federal courts have basically said the courts are not the jurisdiction through which reparations can be decided. In other words, you can't force a corporation in America to pay reparations. It's a choice they're going to have to make. And obviously there's going to be pushback. A lot of corporations, I think with pressure, would choose to do this. A Silicon Valley company that formed 3 years ago, yeah, I think that people, again, can be nuanced and can be reasonable and say, this is a corporation that really is not...
David, people certainly mostly aren't particularly reasonable, and they're certainly not reasonable on this issue. You talked about Black and white households. I mean, you've heard this argument a million times, but what about the argument, why should whites who came to America after slavery, why should they be liable? And what about the many Black Americans who came to America after slavery? You're conflating black and white inequality and the consequences of slavery. They may be connected, but they are also...
But you're saying white households that came to the United States after slavery shouldn't be liable. What does that mean, be liable? Who's going to hold them liable? How are they going to be liable?
Why should their argument might be that why should their tax money be paid to, why should their wealth be redirected to Black Americans when they weren't even in the country during the slave period?
Because we all, as American citizens, have decided to participate in the glory of citizenship in America, and there's also a burden of citizenship. We all have to pay taxes for things that we don't agree with. We all pay taxes to fund wars abroad that we may not agree with, other policies that we may not agree with. Nobody's specifically saying a white family that came from Poland in the 1980s is specifically liable, but this is something that as a society, it is a gaping wound, the original wound for which our country was created. We all have a responsibility and a dimension to play in healing that wound. I think saying that these families are unjustly going to be liable, again, this is the way this argument gets twisted. It's something as a country, I feel it is our destiny to look at this wound, to heal it. And if you want to be part of the story of America, that is going to need to be part of your responsibility as a citizen too.
As you know, a lot of people strongly disagree with you. There was some Pew research I found that suggested, surprise, surprise, that blacks and whites are far apart on their view of reparations for slavery. In America, where there are already highly inflammatory divisions between blacks and whites, where you have certain politicians who play on those divisions, is this an issue that might only compound those divisions, the threat of violence, the hatred?
Yes, but let me just point out one thing. You mentioned this Pew poll, and it is true that white households are the major obstacle to the issue of reparations from the standpoint of public opinion. Something like 14 to 18% of white households only support reparations. But a small thing, that number is up from 4% in 2000. There is a trend whereby this issue is becoming more of a palatable issue. It's an incremental change. It's going to take a long time. Yes, it is not, the mainstream of white America does not support this issue. I think part of the reason they don't support this issue is because they don't understand how enslavement created the wealth that our country enjoys as a whole up into this day. Will this fan racial division? Sure, I'm sure it will. That's something that politicians are going to have been taking an advantage of and will. That doesn't negate the need to do this.
How's it supposed to work, David? I mean, what about African Americans who are wealthy? Are they supposed to get reparations?
Yes. I think any black family that can trace its ancestry to formerly enslaved people, yes, they deserve reparations. It's because it's not the issue is not just about closing the wealth gap. That is one thing. It's also about recognizing the systemic abuse of black people for centuries in America. You cannot put a price tag on that trauma, on that pain. But you can, through various means, including cash payments, you can recognize that. That is a very American thing to do, by the way, to recognize pain, to try to compensate it through payments. Yes, what a rich black family deserves reparations as much as a poor black family, because their ancestors suffered through that too. It's not just about who is deserving because they need the money.
It's going to annoy. Yeah, I take your point. It's going to annoy. Let me give you a very personal example. My wife is black. I was just in Mississippi with her mother, and we went back to the shack where she was born. She's directly related to slaves in 19th century Mississippi. She's now very senior at Google, much wealthier than I am. Why should I benefit? Because ultimately, I would benefit because of all this. And I've got nothing to do with slavery one way or the other. I only came to America about 20 years ago. I'm not even an American citizen.
Why are we looking at how you will benefit? Why is that the lens? Why isn't it that her?
Well, that's how I think people think. And why should I be the beneficiary of this policy?
But this is what the problem is. Like, the point is not about why are we focusing on how this will affect the white people and how white people will unjustly benefit? Why aren't we focusing on your wife's family? That's the more important thing. I understand this is how this is going to get twisted, but the more important fact is that your wife's family, who are the descendants of slaves, would receive some compensation, some recompense for the injustices that they faced and have faced over centuries. That's the more important point. Not that you might benefit. Yes, okay, so every family where a black person is married to a white person, we shouldn't give them reparations? No. That's just another boogeyman, I think, or a red herring.
Should this be a one-time payment? Or is this, if you had your way and the federal government did what you want them to do, would this be something that would continue over generations?
Yeah. I mean, again, we're talking about $14 trillion. Nobody expects this amount of money to be paid out at one time in 1 year. Their brighter minds than ours will have to decide how the mechanics of this will work. It can be paid out over 10 years, over 20 years. It can be paid out to one generation of a family to another. It's not that, so it most likely, it seems practically speaking, that this will take the form of continual payments over a long stretch of time, given that it's a large amount of money.
But that's $14 trillion. I mean, what's the U.S. what is the US GMP?
Well, I'll tell you that in 2021, the U.S. government spent $6 trillion. So, yeah, it's an astronomical sum of money. But look, we're talking about an astronomical crime. There's nothing to compare it to. We have no basis of saying, well, it's like this or it's like that. The United States became a wealthy country, became what it is today because of this crime. You can't expect to have an easy analog to compare it to. It is an astronomical sum of money. It's an astronomical wound. It's an astronomical injustice. So it's not going to be an easy thing to address. But that, again, that is the burden of our citizenship. That is the destiny, I think, of this country, is to figure it out.
But slavery isn't unique in the United States. In fact, it still exists in some parts of the world.
Yeah, but that's not the argument. We're talking about how to repair the injustices of slavery in the United States. What, as a country, do we owe to our fellow Americans in the form of social justice, reparative justice, in the form of addressing social harm? We're not talking about slavery in a different country. We're talking about slavery that happened here, concretely enriched this country, made it what it is today through wealth. So, yes, it is terribly unfortunate that slavery takes place, a modern form of it, around the world. That is an issue that people are talking about and will talk about, but that's separate from the issue of reparations that we're talking about now.
If, David, if black and white households, if their wealth was equivalent, if there was no difference between the wealth of blacks and whites today in America, would you still be making the same argument?
No, I think that, well, it would depend, because again, this is not just a monetary issue. The point of reparations, a big part of it, close the wealth gap between white households, black households. How we as a country, though, address the issue of the injustice is also a big part of this. It can't be that a corporation pays, and the corporations, by the way, have done this in the past, $5 million and says, we made some scholarships for black Americans, we're done with this. Or we as a country say, well, we earmarked $12 billion to 250 black families. We're done with this issue. No more said. There has to be a meaningful way that we as a society recognize this history and repair this damage. We as a society haven't even agreed on certain facts about this history, about how consequential it was, about how much wealth it created.
Finally, what about, I brought up global warming before. The bill you say is 14 trillion. I'm guessing that the bill for global warming is higher than 14 trillion. Does this make the argument also that oil companies, for example, or any kind of fossil fuel company should be liable for the damage to the earth?
Well, I mean, something that I argue in my book is that the roots of our environmental crisis, the destruction of the natural environment, the impunity with which corporations and industry did that, it starts from enslavement. The broad hundreds of thousands of acres of plantation land that were created in the South and as labor camps, they were controlled by individuals, but also corporations that destroyed thousands of acres of trees. And that's where our environmental plight in the United States starts from. Yes, I think that large oil companies, large energy companies whose roots are in that history, they do have a role to play in this too.